Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session on React versus Angular. This is a webinar which is going to actually compare these two frameworks and how exactly they tally with each other and what exactly are the differences and how they are actually used by the community. So in today's webinar, this is basically going to be the agenda. So we are going to talk about variations in terms of type, architecture, template, learning curve, concept, rendering, DOM, data binding, debugging, speed, author, and popularity. So today we are going to discuss basically between React and Angular, and we are going to focus on the areas as listed. So we're going to focus on type, architecture, template, learning curve, concept, rendering, DOM, data binding, debugging, speed, author, and popularity. So the first point actually talks about the type. So React is basically a front-end library, and when you talk about the MVC architecture, it predominantly focuses on the view side of the MVC architecture. Okay, so when people actually have to build applications using React, they try to actually focus on the user interface part and build components which are going to help in building the UI. Okay, the second aspect is that React is primarily a library, so it is not an end-to-end solution which can be used for building large-scale applications. Okay, so in today's world, if someone has to build an end-to-end solution, then he will have to combine React with some of the other technologies like Redux as a state container and Node.js or Express.js for basically helping the server-side implementation, or libraries like Immutable, which can be used for data storage and so on. Okay. But when you talk about Angular, it's basically an end-to-end solution. It's a framework which can help you build the entire MVC stack, right from the view to the model. It has been there for a while now. It's actually developed by the Google team, and they actually initially, started with the 1.x version, which was basically used to build MVC-based solutions, and then they moved to Angular 2 and then Angular 4, which are the revamped versions of Angular. But predominantly, it's a framework. Okay? So it basically helps you to build end-to-end solutions, and these are some of the key differences between two. In fact, both of them are actually maintained by different teams altogether. Okay, so React has its own separate team. I mean, it actually started as a project from Facebook, but then now it's an open source library. Whereas Angular was built by the Google team, and now again is pretty much supported as open source. Okay, so these are the key differences from the type perspective. Now let's move forward. Moving to the architecture side, as I was quickly discussing, that React is predominantly focusing on the view. Okay, so in terms of the technology terms, we basically call it as a UI-based component development, where the whole library, sort of asks the developer to only think in terms of the view representation rather than really worrying about, how exactly the controller interaction is going to happen or how exactly the business logic is going to flow. Those aspects are actually not linked to the React architecture. Okay. But as I was saying, that when you talk about Angular, we are actually thinking about everything. So it's going to deal with the view, the controller, and the model. The whole architecture is laid around that area. How it differs basically is because when someone is thinking about React, from a developer perspective, he does not have to worry about other aspects, which means that the whole focus is only on the view part. And that has also resulted in a lot of advantages in terms of building reusable UI-based components, which has been a focus area in the current world. Angular definitely is a preferred framework when someone is looking at building single-page applications which have to be built end-to-end, where you are looking for everything together. Okay, because as I said, that since React only has the view portion, so you have to integrate it with some other frameworks or libraries which have to support the controller part or the model implementation, which obviously is an additional I would say effort which is required when you're trying to define the architecture. Okay, but the advantage obviously is from the view perspective, which sort of gives it a lot of advantages, right? When you think about current development in today's world, where a lot of focus is on the user interface itself. Okay, so from that perspective, this architecture gives a lot of advantages. Okay, so both architectures are trying to solve similar problems, but they vary in terms of the thought process. So React focus is on the view, whereas Angular is all about MVC altogether. Okay. So I think there is a question from one of the participants, Santosh, and he wants some clarity on MVC. Okay, so MVC basically stands for Model View Controller. So It is very old pattern in the web application space where we try to divide the application into three areas, which is the view, the model, and the controller. A view is something which typically is trying to focus on what the user sees on the application. So what is visible to the user. Whereas model is something which is focusing on the business logic or the data integration. Each of these two areas are trying to solve different problems. So earlier what was happening is there is to be a single logic which is to take care of everything, right from the view representation or the business logic or the data integration. But that resulted in a lot of challenges whenever we had to make code changes. It resulted in impacting everything. So one of the very key principles of application architecture is something called as separation of concerns, where you can reuse each portion without impacting the other portion. So if today I want to build the view representation, then it may initially cater to, let's say, graphical data, then it may cater to the HTML data, maybe later on to the bar charts and any number of things. But I can just include additional views without impacting the model because they are separated from each other. And the only channel of communication between the view and the model is something called as a controller, which acts like as a single point of entry for the application itself. And so this whole pattern basically makes sure that every developer can independently change each section. So you can change the view separately, you can change the model separately without impacting each other. Okay, so that's a very critical advantage which the MVC architecture provides, and it has been predominantly used all the time when you think about building a good solution for web applications. Okay, so I hope Santosh that has clarified your question. Yeah, so I see an acknowledgement from Santosh, so I think we can move forward now. So let's move on to the next section. So next is about the learning curve. The main thing is that React basically has been built in terms of best practices from what the earlier frameworks were doing. Okay, and they have also tried to keep the overall focus very simple. So if someone has to actually build an application using React, then he can get started very quickly, and he can learn the concepts faster and start building applications. In terms of Angular, in general, the framework is very flexible, but initially to understand the concept, it may take a little bit of more time. And then once you get familiar, probably you will be able to develop things faster. So React's advantage, I think, is definitely more about a lot of applications and samples and everything is there, and there's very good documentation. If someone wants to really get started, I think he should be able to do that much faster. Okay, that's one of the key advantages, and that's the reason why the popularity of React currently is significantly higher. Let's move ahead. So I think in terms of the learning curve in general, I think React definitely will take lesser time as compared to AngularJS. Okay. So the concept, I think the way React has been built, it was a thought process to use a technology called as JSX, which will actually help you to embed the HTML into the JavaScript itself. This is not a common terminology in any of the earlier frameworks, but in today's world where we have to do a lot of rendering through HTML, and you also want to use the same with the JavaScript, you definitely want some type of flexibility into the library or the solution. And React is able to do that pretty effectively using the concept of JSX, which actually is able to do this. And eventually what happens is JSX gets converted into JavaScript, and which actually helps you to take care of the overall rendering. Basically, in terms of Angular, you will be embedding the JavaScript into HTML, like the way it is defined. And obviously, there is no specific provisioning in place where you can actually embed the HTML into the JavaScript at this stage. Okay. But having said that, coming forward, I think in the next, I would say, iterations of Angular, I think they will be coming up with some solution where you can easily embed the JavaScript into HTML as well. At this stage, if at all there has to be any iteration of the HTML, then that is actually taken care by having some type of template, and you will be using some type of markup technology, the way you see in this screen where you have this double curly braces, which is used for passing this parameter, which in this case is basically a way of model propagation. So that is definitely used, but there isn't a specific technique right now to embed HTML into JavaScript. Okay, so I think, as I said, that in future versions of Angular, I think this concept is going to come up, but at this stage, it's not really present. Okay, so I think this is one very interesting feature which React has at this stage. So now moving forward, let's talk about the template. So the template is basically a focus area about how the application is structured. So everything in the React talks about JSX. I think it's a central entity of implementation, which is a combination of HTML and JavaScript together. The reason why JSX was defined was basically to give it an object-oriented flavor, which I think is sort of missing in JavaScript at this stage. And by using object-oriented flavor and having static typing, you can actually take care of a lot of programming issues at initial stage itself. That's basically more on the compile time side. At this stage, Angular doesn't really have this feature. So it's basically a combination of HTML and JavaScript together. Okay. So in terms of the overall approach, I think JSX syntax is quite simple. So if today someone wants to learn JSX, I think he should be able to learn that pretty quickly because it is just a combination of HTML and JavaScript. And a lot of the features of HTML exist in JSX also. So I think with some small learning time, I think developers should be able to pick up JSX pretty quickly and start using that for implementation. One of the other features it provides is that whatever limitations are there in the current HTML, if someone is trying to use it for the state propagation, then he can easily do that using JSX. Okay, so I think that's some features which JSX provides. So there are certain extensions already provided on the default implementations of HTML to sort of take care of the state management easily. I think Angular is more about HTML and JavaScript together. So obviously you have to use each of these features separately when you're trying to build Angular applications, which I think every developer is aware of. But yes, the syntax and the conventions in Angular are again extended. So there are a few additional features which Angular provides so that it can take care of the overall approach of building good applications for single page. Okay, so those extensions are there in Angular as well. But from a templating perspective, it is more about HTML and JavaScript being used together. So that's basically more from a template perspective. So now let's move forward. The next part is basically on the rendering. When I talk about React, in general, the overall rendering is more or less controlled from the server side. Okay, so React in general basically is a technology which is focused more on building the user interface. So it will basically define the user interfaces, will define the layouts, but not really control how the rendering is going to happen. The overall rendering is usually being driven from the server side. So it may be dependent on the overall state management, or there may be a concrete implementation there to actually take care of rendering. Okay, so from the rendering perspective, the rendering is going to be defined from the server side itself. Whereas Angular in general is a client side driven technique. Okay, so the whole rendering of how the data is going to look like is actually being defined at the client side. And the reason for that is because Angular is a complete MVC solution. The only interaction it is going to have with the server is probably through some type of REST API calls, which are actually going to get the data from the server, and then how the data is going to look like is actually going to be defined at the client side itself. So that's a very core difference. I think the way React was thought about was basically to make sure that people only focus on building user interfaces, and then bind it with some other technologies like Redux and Node.js and Express, which basically will be used for the overall rendering perspective. So that's basically how they differ from each other. And I think rendering does play a role, but I would say in terms of performance, I think both these frameworks are really fast in terms of how things work out. Because although there is a server-side rendering in React, the way the whole state management has been defined and the way it works with technologies like Redux, this whole rendering part happens very, very instantly. So the rendering, when I say in React, it is more about how the state gets changed. That's basically what is being controlled. And in conjunction with some other features, this thing again happens pretty fast. Okay. So these are some of the key advantages where React works. Whereas the client-side rendering is all about rendering being handled at the client end itself. Okay. So I think these are the variations, and a lot of frameworks are following the client-side rendering technique, and a lot of frameworks are following the server-side rendering technique as well. Okay. So now we'll move forward. The next portion is basically about the DOM structure. This is one of the key differentiators between these two frameworks. React basically uses an additional data structure, which it terms as the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM basically sits between the browser and the real DOM. So what basically happens here is that when someone has to make an updation to the DOM structure, the virtual DOM basically helps in determining what are the areas which are changed, and it does that using an algorithm which it calls the diff and the patch algorithm. This algorithm basically sort of determines that okay, which are the exact nodes in the DOM structure which are modified, and based on that the changes will be propagated to the real DOM. So one of the key advantages here is that the entire DOM structure need not be traversed, which basically gives a lot of speed and a performance advantage when someone is using React. In case of Angular, at this stage, there is no support for a version. So whatever changes are going to happen, they're going to happen on the real DOM itself. Okay. So obviously this is something which is inherent in every framework in general, excluding a few frameworks which are adopting the virtual DOM technique. So from the overall speed perspective, since the changes are happening on the real DOM, obviously it's going to run pretty slow. So I think that's one key differentiator, and probably that has resulted in a lot of advantage to React in terms of speed and performance. Okay. So I'm just having a question from Vijay, and he has some doubts about what exactly DOM means. So DOM is basically something called as the document object model. So document object model is a sort of a data structure which typically is followed in all templating technologies like HTML, XML, and so on. Okay, so when the data is represented for an HTML or XML, it will be represented using a tree structure, which is termed as DOM. And the whole layout of the HTML or the XML will be stored. Okay, so whenever we build any application, we are always interacting with HTML. Okay, so the HTML is actually going to be converted into a DOM structure, which is then going to be manipulated and processed. Okay, so DOM is inherent in the overall data structure technologies for browsers, and all the frameworks and technologies use DOM inherently for maintaining basically the HTML structure. Okay, the whole layout is going to be stored in a tree format, and then it will be manipulated. Okay, so DOM is like inherent, and both Angular and React are dependent on that. But as I said, since React is using a virtual DOM, that basically means that it is using an additional DOM data structure for doing the processing, which gives an advantage. Okay, so I hope that clarifies your question. Yeah, thanks, Vijay. So let's move forward. The next part is basically a data binding. So in terms of data binding in Angular, there is just one single flow. Okay, the whole flow is that whole framework actually depends on something called as a state, and the only way the state can change in Angular is basically by dispatching something called as an action. So when the action is dispatched, it is actually going to result in a change in the state, and once the state changes, the data is going to be propagated into the view. In case of Angular, there is no such concept of a one-way binding because there is a two-way binding supported, where the data can be propagated from the view to the model or from the model to the view. So it's basically a two-way technique. Angular was one of the first frameworks to actually support two-way binding, and the reason for that is because in many cases what was happening is if there was any changes done in the view side, then you had to make a separate call to actually update the model, which used to take a lot of time. So Angular actually extended the HTML layouts to make sure that whenever a change occurs in the view, it's going to be propagated to the model. In Angular 1, it was happening using something called a scope, and in Angular 2, it basically happens using an object structure. Okay, and it gives a lot of advantage because there's a consistency between the view model and the changes get propagated to each other very, very quickly. Okay, React, the reason why one-way binding is there is because they wanted to control how the data changes are going to occur. Okay, and to do that, they have defined only a certain flow in which it can happen, and which is basically by dispatching the action itself. So the way it happens in Angular is different, where you have a model and a view, and they are basically used for binding with each other. So in terms of the diagrammatic representation, you can assume that that's something is happening between this the store and the view part here. So this is a very key difference. I would say this was one of the key differentiators which Angular brought about as a framework initially, but probably it again resulted in a lot of challenges in the way the data binding was happening. Whereas React, it sort of works pretty differently, where they have just restricted the whole change of how the data is going to be propagated. And with this restriction, I think you also get a lot of advantages. Okay, so I think this is where the data binding is one of the other key differentiators in both these technologies. So let's move forward here. Next part is the debugging part. I will say here React as a framework, sort of doesn't really give a specific advantage in terms of the runtime. I would say it's more about the compile time, where you will be getting issues or problem reported at the compile time. If someone really wants to debug at the runtime, then he can use the console.log, to which he will be able to determine a lot of issues. Angular brought about certain changes in the way this whole technology works. They have a specific technique where at runtime, if someone wants to really make certain changes, he can observe behaviors, can make the changes, and it will actually sort of rebuild the changes very quickly. And you will be able to see the changes happening on the screen itself. So you can actually control a lot of behaviors at the runtime in Angular. I think it's one of the key advantages I see. And if someone finds issues, problems, then he can actually observe the behavior immediately, because whole process happens so quickly that the developer can see the change. So he doesn't have to really involve himself only in the console log, but he can see a lot of other behaviors. I will say that same thing is obviously not at this stage possible in React, because you have to rely a lot more on the console.log. But having said that, in today's world where you have a lot of technologies and you can use things like developer tools, okay, so that gives you a lot of advantages also in terms of seeing behavior. Okay, so if someone wants to really understand how things are happening, then I think React, when use it with Redux, they provide you something called as the Redux tools, for example, where someone can actually understand how the state gets traversed, and you can actually make corrections. So these advantages are there in React also, but the way the whole technology was thought, it was more centric on the compile time side. Okay, so let me move forward now. Speed. Yes, I think React has definitely a key advantage, and I think the reasons for that is because of the virtual DOM concept. Okay, the virtual DOM is one of the key differentiators, which actually helps you to build and render the data very quickly, because whenever something changes, it's able to update the DOM quickly and render the data back into the screen. Angular at this stage, because it still has to update and interact with the entire DOM structure, it does get a certain impact in terms of the performance and speed. Also, Angular is an end-to-end solution, so you actually end up creating a lot of different type of objects in Angular, which definitely do impact the speed part. And React thinking a lot about reusability and optimization and the way the updates happen. I think they happen pretty fast here. Okay, so in terms of the rendering part, I think React definitely has an edge in terms of the speed perspective. Okay. Now let's talk about who exactly built these frameworks. So React was actually a project from Facebook. So it never actually started off as a library. So Facebook actually started React as one of the projects in their organization, and they found that it actually added value to whatever they were building. So then they started actually moving this feature to some of the other projects into the organization, and from there on things worked out well for them. So they felt that let's go ahead and move this to the open source. So I think after about 2 years from the start, Facebook actually decided to move React to the open source community, from wherein the open source community started contributing heavily to React. And it basically resulted a lot of reusable components and a lot of default components which people around the world have built, and it's actually being used by the current developer community. So this was very important for Facebook in general. Angular was actually invented by Google, but it was actually created as a end-to-end solution. And they started off with Angular 1, and then they moved to Angular 2 and 4. This was basically thought about as a client-side MEC solution, which would help in building single-page applications. Because prior to which, whatever frameworks were there were predominantly focusing on the server-side MEC and not really focusing on something called a single-page application, which basically means that the application is going to be loaded only once. And if someone actually needs to traverse different parts of the application, then they would actually be using predefined templates to do the traversal, and whatever data has to be displayed onto those templates is actually going to be rendered from the server, and then manage at the client side to actually display the data onto the screen. Okay, so that was how it was started, and obviously now even Angular has a lot of contributions from the open source community, but at this stage I would say it's still predominantly managed by Google, so they sort of have their active involvement still at this stage. I would say React has moved ahead, and it's probably been handled more by the open source community, I would say. So in general, yes, these were basically invented by two different organizations, but right now they are again, predominantly more in the open source world. Okay, although I would say Angular is still sort of maintained more by Google team as compared to open source developers. Although there's a lot of contributions now coming in from the open source community as well for Angular. Okay, and this is basically the overall popularity of how these two frameworks stand. I will say, I think about 6 years back, Angular was in the very beginning, probably just getting started, and the popularity started increasing from somewhere around 2012, from where it took off to 2013, and then it was increasing steadily. React started somewhere around 2012, but then the popularity started increasing from 2014. It took it quite a while, probably almost 2 years, before they started getting popular. And then now, I would say at this stage, the popularity of Angular has started to decrease. Probably that's because a lot of people have actually started focusing more on user interface development, where React has a strong advantage. We see that in the last one and a half year, the focus of React has increased steadily, whereas Angular has started to decrease. But with, I would say, the rethought about Angular 2 and the whole revamping process of Angular has now again increased the popularity of this technology. But I think it is still quite behind React at this stage. Okay, and React, with its thought about user face component development, and where the entire, I would say, industry is talking about focusing on web components and UI components, I think React is a framework and a library which is here to be used as a solution for the next couple of years. Okay, so I think that seems to be the path, and even Angular may still be used as a MVC solution, because, as I said, in many cases when someone is really looking for technology which will provide end-to-end solutioning, and definitely Angular will be able to provide that approach. Okay, so definitely both these frameworks are very good, and each of them are trying to solve a different popular sort of problem. But at this stage, I would say React is definitely ahead in terms of the overall popularity perspective. Okay, so that sort of brings me to the end of today's webinar. So thanks everyone for your time today, and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.